their goal. A seed will rise and serve the Lord, and speak of what his hand outpoured. To those not born, the tale will ring. He did it all, our risen King.
But if you've got your Bibles with you, I've got my New King James translation right here in front of me. I'd like you to open up to Isaiah chapter 5. Remember, we look at everything on this channel from a biblical perspective. I've got the New King James here. Isaiah chapter 5, verse 8. Look at this. Woe to those who join house to house, they add field to field, till there is no place, where they may dwell alone in the midst of the land. In my hearing the Lord of hosts said, truly many houses shall be desolate, great and beautiful ones without inhabitant. For 10 acres of a vineyard shall bear one bath, and the home of seed shall yield one ephah. Now the context of this proclamation in Isaiah 5 is that God is looking at the nation of Israel, this is in the time of Isaiah, and saying, look, my vineyard, it was supposed to be a beautiful vineyard, has become a wild vineyard. It has yielded wild grapes rather than good grapes. Did it bring forth wild grapes? That is why I've not done it. Why then have I expected to bring forth good grapes? Did it bring forth wild grapes? Like, in other words, he's saying that the vineyard's gone bad. It's been corrupted. And this theme is very common in the Old Testament. And what he's talking about here is that the wealthy, the powerful, those with legislative power, the version of it they had back then, but also just money power, was stacking the deck so they could gobble up the land of the poor people. And, people might fall into arrears with their payments or their rent, or something, and the land was just being gobbled up, and these wealthy people were living on these massive tracts of land, and there was no room for anybody else to have their own land. Now, does that sound familiar? That sounds really familiar, doesn't it? So what this is reflecting on is in the law of ancient Israel, in Deuteronomy and Leviticus, particularly in Leviticus, it talks about this in some really powerful chapters, is they had a situation where the people of Israel, the tribes, and then the people who made up those tribes were allotted a certain amount of land. And that land was not just theirs, it was their families in perpetuity, but they were only to steward it. And they were not to sell it in perpetuity, because that land was supposed to stay in their family, in their kin. Remember, when Ruth wanted to marry Boaz, another man got the first option to inherit the land that would come with her and all of that, because he was the closest kinsman redeemer, because the land was supposed to stay in the closest family possible. Boaz was not as close in the general tribal structure, I should say. So basically, this is God set up this system so that people would be protected. So even if they went into debt, there were these debt jubilees that would happen every generation or so, like it was something like 49, 50 years. And then the land would go back to the family whose it was, even if they'd lost it through debt or through some other means. It was not to be sold in perpetuity. And the purpose of this law was to make sure that no one was intergenerationally destitute or poor. Now that's really important to understand, so that no one was intergenerationally destitute or poor. That was the purpose of this legislation. And that is really important to understand, because we have a situation in Australia where our housing system is heading in the same way that Israel got to in the time of Isaiah, where the rich are gobbling up all the land, and it's getting harder and harder. And we've also got a situation in Australia where people are becoming intergenerationally poor, and they're falling through the cracks and ending up on welfare. We used to talk from a social perspective as pastors and Christians. We'd often talk about the fact that you've got the multi-generational welfare families, but that's growing and it's getting worse. And part of the reason it's getting worse is because homes are being gobbled up by the wealthy. How is this going to go? It's not going to go well. Now, I'm going to reflect on some of what Scott says tonight, biblically and philosophically and practically, and I might even push back on some of what he says, but he's got some really powerful information here, which I think is useful and can help us to really get an understanding of the situation our country is in. So with no further ado, let's start listening to Scott, and we will start reflecting on it.
The poor shall lead and be made whole. The hearts that seek will find their goal. A seed will rise